Hi, I'm Sharaad Kuttan and welcome to Let's Talk, the show that tries to bring you the most important conversations of the day. Today we're going to be looking at English literature as kind of a reflection of Malaysian society and our relationship to this language that's been in this part of the world for over 100 years. Help me in this conversation, I have K.S. Maniam, who's a well-known novelist and academic. His first novel, The Return, was published in 1981. He's also a recipient of several awards, including the Raja Rao Award in 2000 for his outstanding contribution to literature of the South Asian diaspora, because someone of Indian descent. Also with me, Malakai Edwin Vedamani. He is a professor of modern English literature at the School of English at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia, a short story writer, poet, bibliographer, and critic. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here with me. Now, I kind of started out by saying I think there's something about the English language, and we fight about it, at least in the public sphere, quite a bit about its role or place and what its relationship to the national language ought to be. But for you, Maniam, who've used English as your expressive language in terms of the literatures you've written, what does English mean to you? I mean, how do you kind of make sense of English in a Malaysian context, your own particular identity, the identity of, in terms of this is the nationalist rhetoric? How do you make sense of all that?
Well, I think it has, I have to mention, a kind of personal history, you see. When I began speaking when I went to school, they put me in Tamil school first, you see. I found it all very enclosed and dismal and whatnot. So I said, no, I'm not going to be here for long. You better switch me to an English school, which they did. My father did anyway, and I was grateful to him. And that's the desire, maybe subconscious, to go beyond one's own inherited or mother tongue and so on, must have come from a subconscious need to broaden rather than and expand and include the wider world than to be caught in one's language and in its world. Right.
And where did you grow up, Maniam?
I grew up in Sungai Petani, Kedah. So, they went to their premier school nowadays, called Ibrahim School.
Right. It was very interesting because that trajectory, and you mentioned the fact that you yourself wanted to kind of broaden your horizons, and English language and English language education was the way that you saw a way out of whatever you felt enclosed by. Edwin, what about you? I mean, what's your relationship to English? You're slightly younger vintage than Maniam, slightly, I'd say. I think we're all about the same.
I come from a Methodist tradition, so Methodist Tamil Church, which was bilingual, both Tamil and English, and went to Methodist Boys Secondary School, again a very premier English medium school. So I think mine is an urban experience, and so very early I was exposed to reading the Bible in English. Later reading in English was the mainstay for us because my father was a news vendor. We had all the newspapers in the house. We didn't read the Malay newspapers, but we certainly read the English newspapers, the magazines. So very early in life, the introduction to literature. I remember going to British Council, which was in Bukit Aman, going to the Lincoln Cultural Center. So I think living in Brickfields and in Kuala Lumpur gave me access to English very early in life, and that kind of grew. Yeah.
Right. I mean, Maniam, for you, I guess, straddling the kind of, the independence era and, coming from a more British-orientated one, and then the change in sort of emphasis in terms of the country's desire to embrace Malay as a national language, and then in what has been decades of ambivalence about English, right? Recognizing it as the language of commerce, of globalization, of knowledge, same time not wanting to sideline the national language and so on and so forth. I mean, was it difficult for you? I mean, I know that some people, perhaps of your generation, made the conscious choice to switch, like Muhammad Haji Saleh, who used to write in English and then started writing in Bahasa Malaysia. Yourself, I mean, did you ever have those dilemmas?
I don't think so, because my approach was rather personal in the sense that I wanted to write in a language where I could be comfortable in, a language which would be flexible enough to do what I wanted it to do, and there was English for me. So, you know.
What's interesting, what do you mean by flexibility? What is it that, how would you describe the flexibility of a language?
For example, I mean, if you take a short story called Radna Muni, which is written, and of course, in English, but when people read it, I'm not reading English, I'm reading Tamil. So that's the kind of flexibility I'm talking about, because it can accept another layer of another layer of meaning from another language, and and be very accommodative. See, that's what I meant.
But would that be true of other languages as well? I mean, the ability to, I mean, if the person writing so wanted it, to be accommodating, to in fact absorb. We look at the Malay language, it's replete with languages of the world. I mean, from Persian to Hindi to whatever, right?
But if you look at this idea of world Englishes and new Englishes, you find that English is then reworked to carry the burden of the new users. So when I write, I'm sure there's a strong sense of Indianness as KSS does, and probably in different ways. Same as when you read something from the Philippines, you can sense that there is a sense of Philippines, and the identity does get transferred through the language, because the language as a medium very often carries our culture.
Well, this is interesting, because I come from well, I mean, officially an Indian family, but I mean, we're so in some ways detribalized, and we're kind of, in many ways, have gone beyond the ethnic identity. I mean, carry very little of that in my DNA. I mean, do you see that as one of the potentials, that in fact the English speaker becomes increasingly cosmopolitan, global, indifferent to their origins?
That's already happening. You take people like entertainers like Russell Beatus, for example. He talks in a language which is English, which is not overly tinged by Sri Lankan or Tamil or anything like this. So he has taken it to another level. The kind of transition from English to Indian or Malaysian English is now wearing off, and this other language, much more interesting and exciting, because it allows you to be even more inventive, is now the thing.
Talking about being inventive, in the last minute before we go to a break, why English? Why short stories, poetry in English? Have you ever experimented with other languages?
I can only function in English. So, you really don't have a choice when that's your primary language.
And no guilt about it?
No, none whatsoever. Very happily writing in English, because that's what I want to do, and that's what allows me, the language that allows me to be creative in it. I think that's how we see it. You don't see it as a colonial language or somebody else's language. It is my language. This whole idea of native speaker and all that rubbish that we hear these days doesn't really stand anymore, because all of us have a right to the language as long as we are competent and we can be creative in it, I would say.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that statement of affirmation for the English language. Okay, we'll take a short break and we'll be back. Stay tuned to Let's Talk. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad. With me, K.S. Mani, because well-known novelist, also an academic, as well as Malakai Edwin Vethamani, who is an academic, but also a creative individual in his own right, short stories, poetry, and he's edited this new edition of short stories, a very important one, because it's both kind of a document of a history of English literature as well. So that's Ronggeng Ronggeng, Malaysian short stories, just out today. Available at all leading bookstores, Kinokuniya, Gerak Budaya, and so on and so forth. And this is K.S. Maniam's new collection of poetry, Two Heartbeats Away. Right? So let's talk about this first, Edwin, this collection, and who's in it, and what did you hope, as editor, bringing these short stories together? What story did you want to tell on a meta level did you want with this collection?
Actually, this book emerged from the work that I did as a bibliographer. So as I was actually collecting data on short stories, novels, all these creative writing that has come out by Malaysians. One of the largest genres is actually the short story genre. And what I wanted this collection to be is a kind of a representative volume of work that has come from the beginning of writing short stories by Malaysians. So the first poem in this collection is actually from 1959. It was actually in an earlier collection of writers who were actually students from the University of Malaya in Singapore, people like Wong Gang Wu. Yeah, so, and this collection actually straddles 60 years of Malaysian writing, 28 voices. So you have Lee Kok Leang and K.S. Maniam's important short story, Haunting the Tiger. So it's representative of the different periods in time, and it's also, in a way, collective voices of multicultural Malaysians writing in English. So you have young people like Hana Alkaf, who just published a young adult novel, yeah, and it also includes Saras Manikam, who won the Commonwealth Prize. These people were already in this collection even before Saras went on to win her Commonwealth Prize, not because she won that it's inside here.
Well, which is in itself not a problem.
Yes,
but,
and it works out very well.
Okay.
Just to add,
Yeah.
the collection actually is dedicated to Lloyd Fernando. And as you well know, Lloyd is one of the early advocates of Malaysian writing in English, and I felt that it's really important that we acknowledge the work that he did. And in a way, this is a continuation of his two volumes, which came out in 1976 and 1981. So it's been a long while, 81 and then 2019, when the next collection of stories has come out. Yeah.
Right. I want to ask you this. I mean, there are two parts to this, but the first part, it has to do with the form. Because you're saying you have found many short stories, right? I mean, that in terms of English literatures from Malaysia, short stories as a form has dominated. Mani, do you have any sense of why that might be, as opposed to poetry, as opposed to novels? Why would the short story be a form that is amenable to the ideas or the expressive desires of writers?
Well, I suppose it calls for a different, and maybe in a sense, I'm saying this in a sense, qualifying it, an easier discipline to follow in writing a short story, but not so with the poem, you see. So poem is much more demanding. So the first thing that, a person say, right, who's proficient in English and so on, say, no, I'm going to try my hand at writing, I'll go to the short story, not the poem, because the short story is amenable to my desire to make it to do the things I wanted to do.
This is very interesting, because I think when people kind of just looking at things, right, the novel seems like a hefty bit of work, because it's, it's usually 300 pages or so on, so it's lots of words. Short stories, less words. Poetry, even less words. But what you seem to be suggesting is the demands that poetry makes on the writer, and perhaps also the reader, is actually paradoxically greater. Could you explain that? I mean, you're a professor of the language and the literature. Could you explain why is it that poetry is more demanding than a short story?
Because what the writer does with the form, poetry, with the form, is that he has to put in so many things, so many elements, the feeling, the thought, and so on. Not that this is not there in the short story, but much more, much more intense and condensed manner that it is demanding in that sense. So it takes a long time. It doesn't just pour out of you. Those days that would be called juvenilia trash.
Ooh, juvenilia. Okay, we'll take that polemic up. But I do want to ask, Edwin, this. I mean, for you, right? You've done the short stories. You've done the poetry. How do you see this thing? Is it the economy of words and expression that poetry demands make it that much more difficult?
Yeah. I think poetry imposes certain restrictions in our writing. There's a lot of distillation that goes in. You structure your poems. There are certain images that you want to carry. And so it is more rigorous, and as Maniam said, it's very intense. Whereas short stories gives you a bit more flexibility. You could explore a theme in a certain number of words. Whereas in poetry, especially if you are expressing certain thoughts or certain issues, you want to be careful the kind of images that work together. And poetry also works a lot with sound, and you want the right feel to the poetry. And so there's a lot of sound images, visual images, a lot of senses come into play, and then to capture it in the right words is something that is quite demanding. And also a lot of discipline is needed to go back and rework it till you get it right.
Okay, so I'll turn back to your juvenile trash, I think is what you were trying to say. What you said. So the question is, spoken words become very popular now. And spoken word poetry and poets, led largely by the young. You've seen it, you've heard it. What's your take on it?
Yeah, that's what I'm sort of a little bit anxious, here, because they say, yeah, I know the language well and this and so on, and go into it and produce something. They think it's poetry that it doesn't need so much discipline. I just dash one off. You can't do that. Poetry, it is much more demanding, and you got to let it grow within you. It grow organically, and so on. And finally, when it does emerge, there's a lot of weight in it, depth in it, which you never thought you would find.
Okay, yeah. Which presumably you're saying is absent in that other form. But
no, could I just add on?
Yes, okay, very quickly.
No, having worked with spoken word poets, when I was doing the collection of Malaysian poetry, and I approached some of the writers, and they said, "Oh, we've not published spoken word poetry is different from poetry on the page." But I think that's an artificial distinction, and a lot of spoken word poetry is, in fact, a lot of good poetry is coming out. And I think people are beginning to understand that if you want to call it poetry, you have to have a certain form. And it's not just an expression of angst. The quality of spoken word poetry has improved over the years. And we have people like Maliza Rani, Jamal Raslan,
Omar Musa.
Yeah, quite a few of them. And they have also begun to publish. So, Taboo by Maliza Rani, Sheena Bahardin has 2 collection of poems. Jamal has a lot of his work on YouTube. And I think it's important because they actually reach young people. And I think it's a way into the different kind of poetry that we are used to. So I think it's a good way into poetry.
Okay, yeah. Thumbs up for the spoken word poets. We'll take a short break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad. We're talking about English literature in Malaysia with K.S. Maniam, who's a well-known novelist, and also Malakai Edwin Vedamani, who is a short story writer, poet, and also academic. Put together this new collection of short stories. It actually tells you a history of the country through short stories. Now, I do want to ask you about writing for the world, because English literature is, in some ways, a global literature, right? And there are many expressions. Some of it we define in national terms, Indian writing in English, so on and so forth. And also, like in this year, and at the Georgetown Lit Festival, we had Joka Al-Hati, who's a prize-winning, Man Booker Prize winner for 2019, was a work written in Arabic, translated in English, and then won the prize. Now, so you have this fascinating mix with translations also now being acknowledged as part of world literature. Mani, when you write, do you think about your audience? Do you think, oh, it's a Malaysian audience or a global audience? What do you seek to, and who do you seek to communicate with these realities in mind?
I think I seek to communicate with the poem itself. You see, go into it as deeply as I can, and put the intensity that the poem calls for, and if it is there, it is there, and I can feel it. If I can feel it in its completeness, then it ought to be felt by the reader in its completeness too. That, I think that is important. When you become overly conscious of your audience, you know, there is a second false self working within you. And that false self spoils the story for the whole story.
But do you think a lot of young writers, because part of the aspiration is not simply to express yourself, but also to become famous, to you know, to kind of achieve success in the conventional ways of that. Do you think that's changed the market? I mean, when you look at what's out there in the world, especially coming from Malaysia, what do you see?
I think this, you know, to want to get a name for themselves through through poetry, I think that should be of secondary consideration, you know, if anything at all. You see, if you are dealing with wood, for just to cite a parallel example, if you're doing something with wood and you're creating a statue of this and that, or say, let's say a fertility queen, for example, you worry about that, you know, and then the statue itself sort of expresses so much fullness and a readiness to be full and productive that, you know, you're amazed it came from you, and that's what it does. And that's what poetry should do itself. You don't think of the audience and then you know, say, I'll put this in, I'll take that out, and I'll put another thing in, and so on. No, you can't do that.
Well, you know, Maniam has now, of course, filled my brains with images of fertility goddesses, voluptuous and, you know, ancient. So thank you very much for that. So where do you stand on this, Edwin? You know, the world English issue.
I go by what E.M. Foster said, only connect. So I think the important...
Only connect.
Connect, yes. It comes from Howard's End, where two words, only connect, is used. And I believe that that's what we want to do as writers. We want to connect with the readers. But we don't think of our readers as our immediate readers, whether it's Malaysian or whatever. I think publishers worry about these things. Then they start putting glossaries and, you know, they get in the way of the text. But as writers, you want to connect. And whether you connect with Malaysians or beyond Malaysia, I think that's well and good. So as a writer, I want to write something that means something to me. And I hope that my readers will connect in what I'm trying to convey in that piece of work. Okay,
well, last minute or so, you're both, you were an educator, or at least you retired some 20 years ago, but you were an educator and taught at University of Malaya for many years. You are an educator. How important, you know, is this education business for you? I mean, in terms of dealing with the English language, because there's so much talk about English, and it's business English and English that's supposed to be functional without the kind of deep idiomatic wealth that, you know, both of you express.
I think this is what I call a cliche approach. You see, a long time ago, it came in. You know, you have to speak some. You know, would-be dealer in something would learn the master's language because, you know, you got to deal with him. And later on deal with your customers. So you have to learn the language. You don't need that anymore, you know. Let it wear off. It is already wearing off, but let it wear off completely, and you function on your own. And then you'll find that, you know, the poetry that's been waiting to come from you will come.
Okay, and Edwin, last words as an educator, in terms of the English language, what would you advise people?
Well, I think find a medium, and for me, if English is your medium, well and good. If Malay is also your medium, very well. There are few people who are bilingual, and I think Malaysians are beginning to look beyond the communicative function of the language. They're also beginning to appreciate the creative aspects. In fact, now we've got creative writing programs. Some people don't favor creative writing programs in universities, but I think parents are a bit more liberal, and so I think the use for English, or how English is being used, is broadening. The creative elements are, you know, emerging. That's a good sign, because we are not just talking about how to order food in a restaurant. We have gone beyond that kind of silliness.
But very quickly, are young people that you teach reading? Because we talk about writing here. Are they reading? Will they pick up a short story? Is a short story far too long for the new generation?
I think they are reading, but what they are reading might be a bit worrying. A lot of reading goes on in, either in their phone or in an iPad, one of the devices. They are reading, but whether they're reading what we want them to read, that's the question. I still have students who say, oh, I couldn't finish the novel for this week's class. But if you give them a novella, yeah, they might be able to. Reading is going on, but maybe the kind of reading that we want for academic purposes, not enough.
Okay, so a little bit distracted. I think we all are slightly distracted in this age. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being on the show. Remember, you can get this collection at any good bookstore. Rungging Rungging, Malaysian Short Stories, edited by Malakai Edwin Vethamani, and also this new collection by K.S. Maniam. It's called Two Heartbeats Away. That's all we have for Let's Talk this week. Come back next week and join me. I'm Sharaad Kuttan, only on Astro AWANI. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.